Hello everyone and a warm welcome back to the channel for the second part of my Ships of War episode concerning HMS Iron Duke and SMS Friedrich de Grosse. Apologies again for very foolishly leaving my armor and protection plans somewhere else because I was rather hoping to have done everything as one video, but never mind. I have managed to source some extra copies, so I'm going to pick up where I left off in the previous recording. So just as a quick recap, in the last video we looked at various aspects of the ship and we discussed the differences in the speed, of which, to be perfectly honest, there were none. At best speeds it was literally half a knot's difference. We discussed the differences in the power of the main battery, the secondary battery, and I raised some questions about the validity of putting in Friedrich de Grosse's rather poorly cited tertiary armament. Now, I'm assuming that with Iron Duke, I didn't say this in the last video, but the problems they had with the rearmost 6-inch guns, which I showed you in the photograph, so the ones that were cited here, I'm assuming that they are showing the ship in her later configuration because the removal of those after guns and their resighting in the central 6-inch battery, or more specifically a little bit above it, was completed fairly early on. And certainly Iron Duke's sisters benefited from the lessons of that ship. Although, interestingly enough, because of the pace of construction, the 6-inch mods didn't quite make it to the Queen Elizabeth, so they had to go through the same thing, or at least one of them did. And I very briefly mentioned the ship's submerged torpedo tubes on the broadside. To be honest, there's not very much to say about those, except that, like many dreadnoughts of their day, they had them. They never fired them in anger. They were a very difficult weapon to employ in the context of a battle line dreadnought because you'd never be close enough, and despite having a very limited traverse, you were still dependent on the portion of your hull facing the right way. So they were never really going to happen. And they just took up an awful amount of space. And they were also a bit of a flooding risk because the torpedo compartments in these ships were very large. And if that space flooded, then you would notice it would have an adverse effect on your stability. But anyway, we did briefly discuss all of those factors. So the only thing I really wanted to go over in this video is the question of the armor protection as it was in reality and as it is represented in this game. And I also wanted to touch on the careers of the two ships because I gave you a very quick rundown of their participation in the First World War in the previous video, but we didn't explore it in any great depth. So, onward to the protection. So, on the ship counters, there is no information regarding the ship's armor and protection. And the reason for that is because the Great War at Sea system has separate sheets of damage records for the ships in the game. And this is great. It provides an element of fog of war, and it means you don't have overcrowded counters with too much information. You can instead enjoy these lovely pictures of the ships. So just to give you an idea of how their system works, the Great War at Sea divides areas on a ship into those protected by heavy armor, those protected by light armor, and those with no armor at all. So it's just those three very broad categories. And in the case of Iron Duke, they have rated the turrets as the primary battery turrets as being protected by heavy armor. So that's the 13.5-inch gun turrets. Or if I bring that picture back again, these fellows here. And they have done the same with Friedrich de Grosse. So if I bring her photo back, just so we're clear. So both dreadnoughts, the main batteries are protected by heavy armor. The secondary batteries, the 6-inch in the case of Iron Duke and the 5.9s in the case of Friedrich de Grosse, are treated as having light armor. Um, Friedrich de Grosse's anomalous tertiaries are also protected by light armor. And in both ships, the hull is given credit for having heavy armor. Now, there's two elements to flotation in this game. The one is the armor protection of the hull, which is fairly obvious. The other is the number of flotation boxes that a ship has. Now, Iron Duke has been rated with 12 heavily armored flotation boxes, and Friedrich de Grosse has 13. So I'll return to that in a moment. Let's have a look at the armor distribution. So I'm going to rely, as I often do, on my friend Fred T. Jane, the originator of Jane's Fighting Ships. Apologies to those of you who have heard this many, many, many times from me before, but for the benefit of those who might not have seen any of my videos before or who might not be familiar with Jane's, he was basically a very interested compiler of detailed information on the world's fleets. And what he wanted to do was give the world's navies, but particularly, his own nationality, Great Britain, a comprehensive directory of the capabilities of the world's fighting ships. Now, he did this through the compilation of his very, very comprehensive publications on a year-by-year basis. So you'd have diagrams of the ships, you'd have details of their armament and their armor. But this wasn't just a reference book. Jane also devised a naval war game, which in its day was very, very realistic, and is still played in some quarters today. The only health warning I would offer with Jane's, and it's particularly pertinent for the dates these two ships were designed and built, is that he was only as good as the information he could get. Now, to be fair to Jane, he tried very hard to make sure he got it right. And as he built his reputation, broadly speaking, many people were willing to share information with him because he was regarded as authoritative. But after about 1910, both the British and the Germans were beginning to get a tiny bit cagey about the exact details of their ships because they could sense trouble was brewing. And giving Jane accurate details of your ships is probably not going to help you if you end up in a future war. And bear in mind, anybody could subscribe to Jane's publication. But the drawings that he supplied were as accurate as he could get them at the time. And even today, they are still a very good representation of the distribution of the protection and the details of these ships. Now, I'd mentioned Jane's naval war game because this is important. He went to a lot of effort to make sure that these were accurately represented so that his war game, which was meant to be entertaining, would also be a useful analytical tool for naval officers. The health warning is the flotation ratings. So this is simply a representation of how much reserve buoyancy a ship has. You'll see it's divided into sections. That's merely so that players can cross off lost buoyancy on their ship record sheet. Obviously, when you run out of buoyancy, you sink. But be very wary of these lines because that is not an accurate representation of the ship's watertight subdivision. It's purely there for game convenience. So armor, very realistic. Ignore that bit down there except for the numbers. So looking at the protection schemes of the two ships, it's fairly obvious. I'll just zoom out a bit so we can look at them in comparison. That the British and the Germans were thinking on very much the same lines. So you essentially have a very thickly armored citadel protecting your vitals and your machinery spaces. If you can spare it, you have additional armor running off to the bow and the stern. But as you can see on Friedrich de Grosse, they've got a decent amount of side armor, but it's much thinner around the bow. And what they've got going on astern there is more of the same, but it's actually a deck lower, so there's not that much protection back there. The bow and stern protection on the Iron Duke is, if anything, even more sparse than that. So, what about the differences in armor? Now, bearing in mind the Great War at Sea is dealing in very, very broad categories, heavy, light, non existent. So, what I'm going to do, because Jane didn't always have access to completely accurate figures in his tables, I'm just going to go through figures based on what we know since the war, to give you an idea of how dense this stuff was and how good it was likely to be. You can see there's a much darker shade on the German ship, implying thicker protection. And broadly speaking, that is correct, but it can also be a tiny bit misleading because I mean, that's a much darker line than that, and it gives the impression that the Iron Dukes were, I don't want to say not adequately protected, but you know, that there was a significant difference, and actually the differences were fairly small. So just to bore you all with some extra detail, the bit we're looking at here is the main belt armor, the bit that forms the sides of the armored citadel in both ships. Now, obviously, the British ship has got a greater area to cover, so it makes sense from a design perspective that the armor will be thinner. As was common practice in both navies, the armor was thickest around the center and it tended to taper towards the ends. And the the ships helpfully used the same kind of armor. It was the German invented Krupp cemented armor plating, so its protective qualities were identical. Yes, the British manufactured Krupp cemented under license, and they had been doing so since the end of the 1890s. So on HMS Iron Duke, the belt at its thickest was 12 inches and it tapered off down to 4 inches. On Friedrich de Grosse, it was 14 inches, so a 2-inch advantage over the British ship, but only 2 inches, mind. And it tapered off towards 3.2 inches at the bow and the stern. So actually, although there's more armour coverage for the hull on the German ship there, it actually ends up being somewhat thinner than you get on the British ship. And you can actually see from Jane's colour coding that that's pretty much identical armour thicknesses, but there would have been a slight difference in thickness. Both ships had protective bulkheads at the ends to protect the bow and stern of the citadel from end-on fire. And this followed the same kind of pattern. So it was 8 inches at its thickest on Iron Duke and a very impressive 12 inches at its thickest on Friedrich de Grosse. So really, the German ship, if she'd been raked fore or aft, would have had much less to worry about than Iron Duke would have done. There's a definite advantage to the Germans there. The turret barbettes, so the bases of the armoured turrets, and also the bit travelling underneath to go down to the magazines, the trunking, that at its thickest on Iron Duke was 10 inches. Tapering down to 3 at the rear ends, or the inboard end of the turret trunks and barbettes. The German equivalents were 12 inches down to 3.2. So again, a slight advantage to the Germans in terms of the turret barbette protection. Also, as you can see from the diagram, and this is an accurate representation, the British only carried the barbette armour down a certain distance, and beyond that they relied on the side protection to keep the arrangements safe. The Germans have been significantly more cautious, and they have carried it down all the way to the armoured belt. So you don't get the slight gap in armour protection that you get in the British ship here. It's not a major problem, but it is a weakness relative to the German vessel. Of course, the problem the Germans have is this nice thick armour is not only necessitated in the case of their centre turrets, but in a way is partially offset by the fact that they're near the sides of the ship. The beauty of being on the centre line is that even if the side armour is penetrated, a lot of its force will be expended and it still has a way to travel before it gets to the centre of the ship. Best case scenario, it penetrates your side armor and then bursts, and it will do a lot of damage to your internals, but splinters won't do nearly as much to your turret trunking as a direct hit would. Whereas on the Kaiser class, the worry is that if a shell penetrates and your trunking is that close to your side armor, there's a good chance that that shell will follow through if it's on the right trajectory, and burst inside your magazine, your turret trunking, which is not what you want. We will never know, but it is very possible that the British battlecruiser Invincible, at least, succumbed at Jutland to that very thing. Having your turrets right on the beam is not that great when you're on the when you're exposed to enemy fire. So, lastly, we have the turrets themselves. Now, Iron Duke's thickest turret armor, of course, on the faces was 11 inches. And Friedrich de Grosse's turrets were protected by 12 inches on the face. They did thin towards the sides and rear, and the turret tops were a little thinner as well, but the proportions were roughly similar. So the British were, broadly speaking, an inch or so behind the Germans. To be perfectly honest, that does not make too much difference in terms of protection. And when you're hit by a 12-inch or a 13.5-inch shell at the correct angle, an inch here or there is not going to make that much of a difference. If it's going to penetrate or deflect, it'll do what it does. But all of this generally suggests a broad picture of a slightly better German scheme in terms of overall armor thicknesses. But the armor layouts, I would suggest, work out pretty much the same. So how does this translate into game terms? I think it's completely fair that both ships have been credited with heavy armor on the hull and on their armament. But now we come to the question of flotation. The Germans have this extra box, which the British don't. Now, I agree with Jane's figures. He gives Iron Duke a lot more buoyancy, or reserve buoyancy, than he does Friedrich de Grosse. And this is correct. The Iron Duke, by virtue of her significantly larger hull, she was 623-ish feet in length, as opposed to the German ship, which was 566 or thereabouts. So that's a significant increase in the length. And the two were actually fairly close in beam as well. I mean, the German ship was about 5 feet wider than the British one. So the British ship has this greater reserve of buoyancy thanks to the extra space within the hull. And also the overall weight of the ships relative to how much hull space they have supporting it. The British come off better there. So in that sense, you would think the British deserve to have more hull boxes. But I think I know why the German ship has been credited with one extra, because if you look at the Admiralty's drawing, ship's plans collection, illustrations of the Iron Duke class, and you compare them with the surviving German drawings of this class of dreadnoughts, what's immediately obvious is that the German ship has much better internal subdivision and watertight protection. So what this means in practice is that the German ship, if it is struck below the waterline, is better able to contain its flooding. By contrast, a lot of Iron Duke's compartments were significantly bigger than her German counterpart, and if hit, they would have allowed more water in before the flooding could have been contained. So yes, great, the British have greater reserve buoyancy, but they're not so great. They're not able to contain the flooding as well as the German ship could. So I think it makes sense from that perspective that the Friedrich de Grosse has that one extra hull box, because the British advantages in basic buoyancy are largely cancelled out by the German ships designed to allow her to survive a lot of battle damage. So I am calling that fair. And so that pretty much brings us to the end of our survey in terms of the statistics of these ships. Overall, I think that this game does a pretty decent job of modelling them. I still have some questions about the armament, but it's not such a big thing that it makes it a game breaker by any means. So where does one go from here? Well, I suppose the $64,000 question is how well did these two perform in combat? And that's a very good question. As I'd said in the previous video, they both served as fleet flagships from 1914 to 1917 until they were very weirdly relieved by other vessels within a short time of each other. Iron Duke by Queen Elizabeth and Friedrich de Grosse by Baden. And they both participated in just about every fleet operation that was carried out in that time. So let's look at Jutland. What happened at Jutland? Now, again, the two never actually fought each other, which can be a bit unhelpful for this exercise. But Iron Duke was fortunate to be in the right position in the British line of battle when they crossed the T of the German High Seas Fleet. And she performed extremely well. She's credited by both British and German sources with having scored 7 hits on the German battleship König in the space of about 10 minutes. And that's firing at a range of 26,000 yards, or give or take, it's 15 land miles. She didn't really do anything much beyond that during the battle, never really sighted any other enemy ships again. The Friedrich de Grosse had a very busy battle, but she didn't really fight under the same conditions. So her first shots were fired in anger at the crippled British destroyer Nomad during the run to the north, and that was only her secondary guns. It's impossible to credit how accurate her fire was because 3 or 4 dreadnoughts were targeting Nomad. She also contributed some main battery fire to the damaged Warspite when she was circling out of control and presenting a target to the German fleet at a range of about 12,500 yards, or again, 8 miles. Quite a few main battery salvos were thrown in Warspite's direction, and while she sustained a lot of hits in that period, it's impossible to determine which ones were courtesy of the Friedrich de Grosse and which ones were courtesy of her squadron mates. The very last shots she fired at the battle were during the night action when she was one of the dreadnoughts that contributed to the sinking of the armoured cruiser Black Prince. Sadly, nobody survived from Black Prince, so we only have German accounts, and again, it's impossible to corroborate how well the Friedrich de Grosse fired during any of those actions. But other than that, her rate of fire was efficient and her crew is believed to have performed well. She did also participate in Operation Albion, the attack on Russian positions at Moon Sound, and she indulged in quite a successful bit of shore bombardment. But Iron Duke never performed an equivalent duty. So the short answer is we'll never know how they would have matched up against each other. You really need ideal conditions for that. But my impression from Jutland is that both dreadnoughts did very well. Both of them returned from that battle with virtually no damage, and indeed neither ship sustained any damage of any consequence during the First World War, if any. So what happened to them afterwards? Well, they both lived, I'm going to say fairly long lives, but in very different ways. Let's do Friedrich de Grosse first. So like most of the rest of the High Seas Fleet, she surrendered to the Royal Navy in 1918. There was in fact, I'll go back to this photograph because that's taken during the High Seas Fleet's last voyage into captivity. Like pretty much the rest of the fleet, the 50 that was scuttled on the orders of Admiral von Reuter, she sank to the bottom of Scapa Flow. She capsized. Her crew did their job very well. And there she remained until the mid-1930s when she was salvaged and broken up for scrap. So that was quite a sad end to a splendid dreadnought. Iron Duke did somewhat better. She lasted in commission until the mid-1920s when she was then turned into a training ship to comply with the Washington Naval Treaty. She was still performing various ancillary sort of back-of-house duties when the Second World War came along. She was an accommodation and training ship by that point. Now, in October 1939, she sustained heavy damage for the first time when the Luftwaffe bombed her. And she had to be beached to prevent her sinking. But the truly impressive thing is, she effectively left the Royal Navy with an unsinkable vessel, because she was lying on the bottom, that looked like an intact battleship. So they patched her up, beefed up her anti-aircraft armament, and she continued to fool the Luftwaffe for a couple more months. They further raids tried to sink the ship, but failed to do so for reasons that were obvious to the British, but less so to the Germans. And so she remained for the rest of the Second World War until she was finally raised and sold for scrap in about 1946. So I suppose out of the two, Iron Duke did much better for herself. But I think in many senses, both navies got their money's worth, although maybe not the Germans, because it was really the scrap merchants that got the final value for Friedrich de Grosse. But there we go. The histories of two, in a nutshell, of two very, very fascinating warships. And I've been very glad to have been able to have a look at these two interesting ships today. I do want to leave the final word because you don't often get representation from these members of the crew with Peggy the Bulldog, who was the Iron Duke's most notable pet and mascot during the First World War. So there you see Peggy in a late war painting. I think that's her General Service Medal, and those are her campaign ribbons. So Peggy remained with Iron Duke throughout the First World War, and she tends to feature in some of the crew's photographs in various archives. And it's always good to see her. The original painting is in the collection of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and it's not presently on display, but you can request to see it. And it's a lovely, lovely representation. I like to end on a high or a cute note if I can with these things. So I'll leave the farewells to Peggy. And it only remains for me to say a huge thank you to all of you for tuning in. I hope you found this interesting. Comments, as always, are very, very welcome. I'll look forward to hearing from you. And until next time, a warm thank you and goodbye to all my long-standing veterans. Thank you guys so much for your company. It's always great to see you. To any of you who might be new, if this is the first of my videos you're watching, you're very welcome. Please have a meander around the rest of the channel. I hope you find something you like. If you're into the Great War at Sea series and you haven't seen my videos about this game system, do check those out. I hope you like them. And I hope that I will see you again. Until next time, take care of yourselves and all the very best. Bye.